First of all, I'd like to thank Icon Water and Keep Australia Beautiful for the invitation to come to Canberra. It's always good to come to Canberra. One of my favourite cities during autumn. I always like to come to Canberra during autumn, perhaps not so much in summer. Matt sort of provided a really good overview of some of the challenges that we face, and it's not necessarily what we face just in the region or as a country as a whole, but if you even look down to the narrow perspective of what we face in an urban environment, those challenges are equally relevant. And we all have our own little horror story that we could relate to in terms of events that clearly illustrates the type of challenges we face in our cities as far as water management is concerned. I'll run through the first few slides very quickly because Matt's pretty much covered those key points, and then talk a little bit about how in an urban setting that there is an emerging paradigm of how we can actually manage urban water in a different way, perhaps in a more holistic way, that perhaps might provide us with some solution in building more resilience and robustness in the way we manage water. And you'll see time and time again throughout literature that there are three key words that are used frequently. One has been used around for a long time: sustainability. Building a sustainable city, the ACT Sustainable Cities Forum, and so on. It's been around for a long time. It continues to have difficulty in getting traction in terms of community association with it, in terms of government. It's always a concept that is too far out in the horizon. It's always too easy for government, I suppose, to defer to tomorrow what we need to do today in the name of sustainability. But in recent times, perhaps in the last 5 to 10 years, you find that the new emerging language is the language of resilience. The language of resilience is an interesting one. It is actually a notion, it came about with many of us having realized that because we failed miserably in sustainability, that we're actually seeing some of the effects of that. And now it is really impacting on us today. We have the droughts and we have the floods, and we now ask questions: what does the future look like? How can we be more resilient to that? Is the government today responsible for delivering resilience in our community? And the answer is yes. While often you find the government would defer the responsibility of delivering sustainability to the next government. A third word or phrase that comes out a lot now is livability. And this is the word that has gained a lot of traction amongst communities. And that is because perhaps communities are less worried about the concept of sustainability and even resilience, but they're more concerned about the notion: growing population, higher vulnerability to climatic extremes, the quality of our life. And so the question of livability is always one that comes through. The idea of a water-sensitive city is trying to marry those together to basically say, to actually deliver on all three, you need to have much stronger whole-of-government approach to your solution, much more integration vertically in terms of local government, state government, federal government, but also in terms of the demographics, the community, the profession, you and I, our capacity to innovate, and also government in terms of their capacity to introduce enabling policies. Not so much prescriptive policies, but enabling policies that enable the profession to innovate, and for the community to actually come along with us in terms of how they would perhaps manage their own behavior in contributing to the whole urban water management game. So this is what I want to talk about. I'll start with my own horror story. Thompson Dam, 1997, almost full, as you can see. This is the intake tower. 10 years later, and it's absolutely dry. We have 18 months of water left for Melbourne. All around the world, there's talk of major water crisis. And that drought, whether you're in ACT, in Perth, in Melbourne, it really shocked us. It shocked a lot of us into thinking that our reliance on predominantly one source of water is incredibly vulnerable. And most of us are reliant on water from our dams, catchment runoff. And if you look at the data in many of our cities, during the millennium drought, it's not as if it didn't rain, it just rained less. In Melbourne, in fact, the rainfall was about 60% the mean annual rainfall. But that reduction in rainfall in a very dry catchment meant that runoff was virtually non-existent. There was a 20% of mean annual runoff occurred in a lot of the catchments that drain into our dams. And it really got us to think about not being dependent on just catchment runoff as our main source of water, because that is the one source of water that is most vulnerable to climate change. In fact, it didn't matter whether climate change would change your mean annual rainfall or change your rainfall. The fact is climate change increases temperature, it increases evapotranspiration, increases the dryness in your catchment. It will reduce your runoff, regardless of whether the rainfall has changed. Now, if you overlay that and say, well, in fact, rainfall might change as well, and you now find that that source of water is probably the most vulnerable. But just as we were thinking about our vulnerability to drought, when the drought broke in 2011, it broke with a vengeance. There were floods everywhere. Melbourne, Brisbane, just to name a few. In addition to that, heat waves were becoming more and more dominant. Highest temperature in Sydney, significant bushfire in Perth due to heat. And they, in fact, also start to impact on the vulnerability of our water supply catchment, as we saw here in Canberra. And it made us realize then, in 2011, that our cities are actually incredibly vulnerable, not just to droughts, but to floods. And the livability of our cities is vulnerable to those issues, as well as the environmental degradation that continue to occur in our city as a result of urbanization. How do we actually start to build resilience to those challenges in our city? Before long, Climate Council, one of the best crowd-funded entity in Australia, good on them, hopefully they'll get some federal funding eventually, came out with a report in basically saying in the summer of 2012-13, we broke 123 meteorological records throughout Australia. There were droughts and there were floods and there were heat waves, you name it, 123 meteorological records since record was kept in that summer. They call it the angry summer. Well, the angry summer in 12-13 was in fact followed by an even angrier summer in 13-14. 156 meteorological records. What is happening, you may ask? And therefore, we are in a situation whereby as our cities are growing, as our dependency on, our reliance on reliable water supply is ever diminishing, or our access to that is diminishing, we find ourselves facing a situation whereby we in fact can no longer predict the probability of future events. For us in the scientific environment, we have this saying, and there's a paper in Science that basically talk about the notion that stationarity is dead. And that is just an interesting statistical jargon that says that the boundary conditions which we assumed when we analyzed the statistics of historical data to understand the likelihood of future events no longer applies. We cannot, in fact, even now assign a probability to the droughts that might happen in future. What are we to do? All we can do, the focus that we need to have, is to think about building resilience. Building resilience to basically ensure that there is structural and social resilience to future climatic extremes. The famous known unknowns and unknown unknowns are real. So the next time you hear someone talk about the 100-year flood or the 200-year flood, you sometimes need to wonder whether it is actually, are we applying the right probabilistic and therefore the right risk to those events? Do we know what that risk is? What are some of the solutions and how do we actually start to build resilience based on those scenarios? I'll start with water security. We've been talking about drought. One of the things that we certainly espouse and certainly are working towards developing strategies for is in fact the notion that we need to recognize that our cities are water supply catchments. There are more water resources in our city than we have given it credit for. The rain that falls in our city, the storm water, is simply considered as one that we need to get rid of very quickly. And yet the lesson we learned from the Millennium Drought was that when we have 60%, when our rainfall was 60% and hardly anything ran off our water supply catchment, they all ran off in our cities. So there's a lot of water resources in there. Our cities is where wastewater are concentrated. There's a lot of resources in our sewage as well. Look at this chart. This was some work that we did and I was very, very pleased to be part of in terms of the Prime Minister's Science and Engineering Innovation Council during the Howard government, right in the middle of the drought, whereby we highlighted the point that if you look at some of our major capital cities, the combined wastewater and stormwater resources far exceeds the water consumption, the water demand in those cities. Now, of course, this is a very simplistic chart because in the end, the question still is how would you capture those rainwater that is intermittent? When it rains, it pours. How would you capture that? What system would you use to capture those things? But nevertheless, if you just look at a simple water balance, you can basically say that if only we can think of our cities as water supply catchment, if only we actually look at harvesting water from our cities, both in terms of wastewater and stormwater, we are not a water-limited economy. And therefore, the whole notion of our growth being limited by access to water is a furphy. The other thing that's really interesting when we look at this is that if all of us, this is different levels of government, accept and sees our cities as a water supply catchment, our land use planning will be so different. The condition we apply to urban development will be so different because we are now protecting our water supply. So you find that this whole notion of rethinking our city can have profound implications in terms of how we look at delivering whole of government strategies for the management and the development and the redevelopment of our city based around the concept that our city is a water supply catchment. Fit for purpose water sources is something that will emerge. If you may find that there are still people that think that it's too hard to be thinking about different sources of water for different use. This is in 10 years from now, every household will have two taps. They will have a drinking water tap and a non-drinking water tap. The source of their non-drinking water tap will be sourced locally. Stormwater, wastewater. The good quality water will no longer be used to flush your toilets. I think, that's reasonable. We should be thinking about that. Our wastewater treatment plant, in perhaps 20, 25 years from now, there will be no wastewater treatment plants. There will all be resource recovery plants. We will be recovering water, energy, nutrients. This is the other hidden thing that we don't appreciate is that the world is actually running out of nutrients. If you think about the whole nutrient budget, the nutrients in the food that we consume are nutrients that we derive from the soil in the agricultural area. We take that nutrient, we consume it. We perhaps consume 20, 30, 40% of that nutrients. The rest of the nutrients are contained in our waste. We kill those nutrients to a level so that we can discharge the water into receiving water like our rivers. Or sometimes we simply just dispose of it out into the ocean. And eventually you get to a point whereby, as you can see now, that because the natural supply of nutrients is diminishing, we introduce a whole new fertilizer industry. And now the raw material for developing fertilizers we are running out. And yet we continue to look at nutrients no longer as a loop, as just a one-way street. You'll find that the future of wastewater treatment plants will be nutrient recovery plants. And this whole nexus of nutrient recovery and productive landscape will get even closer, which makes us even think about how would our future cities look like when it needed to be close to productive landscape because of the recovery of nutrients that are in our sewer. Let's think about our cities in another concept, that not only is it a water supply catchment, but our cities provide ecosystem services. Technologies these days have enabled us to think about building into our cities green infrastructure and systems that biomimic natural processes to cleanse water. That our cities can actually protect the natural environment from the pollution that the city causes. That perhaps our cities can protect the natural environment from climate change, to perhaps nurse its transition much better than what it is doing now, where climate change is causing significant degradation to ecological health in some of our natural waterways. Ecological landscapes become an important concept that will define what future cities would look like. It's no longer open space. Open space is a place you go around and kick a football. Ecological landscapes are where open spaces deliver multiple functions, some of which are ecological functions, some of which are amenity functions, and some of which are in fact water harvesting, ecosystem services functions. This is a project that's very dear to my heart. In 1998 was the first large-scale demonstration of water-sensitive urban design, the Lynbrook Estate. Some of you may remember that. In fact, that was around the time where I started my career and developed concepts of water-sensitive urban design. This picture was taken in 2014 and shows the maturity of that middle swale that is continued to cleanse water that runs off the road, but now creates a corridor for safe passage of flood water, a wildlife corridor, and influencing the microclimate of surrounding properties because of that. Now we're thinking ecological landscapes are in fact systems that can deliver water cleansing, biodiversity, safe passage of flood water, amenity to the residents, all in the one set of infrastructure. Why is water-sensitive urban design continue not to have traction? Because we try and attribute just one of the benefit to one sector and say, you pay for that. While in fact the benefits cross so many different sectors, and the beneficiaries touches on so many different end users and beneficiaries. And yet we expect, if this was a water supply, stormwater harvesting scheme, we expect that the only measure of the worth of this is the cost of 1 kiloliter of water that's generated from this system. That's the problem. The solution really is that until we fix the highly fragmented governance of how we deliver infrastructure, we will always have that problem. Some of the other solutions whereby now the design of biofilters and rain gardens are incredibly advanced. This is based on 10 years of Australian research whereby this technology is now being used in Israel. The country in the world that prides itself on exporting water technology, they are implementing Australian know-how in their cities, whereby with their Mediterranean climate, 5 months of rainfall, whereby the rain gardens are filtering water such that it can be injected into the ground. Because the other 7 months of no rainfall, they actually take water from the ground. But in addition to that, and this is an unintended outcome from the work that we're doing in Israel, in addition to that, during the 7 months when there was no rain, these rain gardens do need watering. We are tapping into a contaminated aquifer and using these systems as kidneys to treat the contaminated groundwater while maintaining the greenery of this system. 3 years of proof of concept in Israel now is being developed into a government policy on how they actually can start to look at stormwater as a resource, but at the same time rehabilitate highly degraded groundwater. This is other projects that are delivered. The concept of those landscapes are now being adapted to deliver vertical landscapes. Vertical landscapes, concepts such as green walls. There are green walls and there are green walls. In fact, I've seen many green walls whereby in the summer it really struggles because green walls are generally of shallow soil. And the soil moisture depletion is really significant in the harsh summers of Australia. And so what do? We water our green wall in summer, and you wonder what's going on. The success of bioretention, biofilters, and rain gardens, and now our ability to think of that system as a vertical system is now emerging. The source of water for that is in fact grey water. In the building, which I'll show you in a video in a minute, in the building, shower water and hand basin water is discharged into the green walls, or living walls as we call them. The soil filters that water and therefore maintain a high soil moisture. Excess water that is filtered can be recovered and reused for toilet flushing in the same building. Kidneys in our cities, kidneys in our buildings. And the result of all that is, of course, clean water environment, healthy waterways. Cooler microclimate. We now have documented proof that greening our cities, especially in cities with dry heat environment, keeping water in the landscape, promoting high level of evapotranspiration is simply a natural way of evaporative cooling. And we now have documented proof that in fact introducing all of this can have a significant effect in cooling our cities during those heat waves which are ever increasing in terms of its frequency and severity. We have documented that simply by cooling our cities during those heat wave conditions, we can reduce the health costs in terms of heat strokes and hospital admissions. Are they actually included in the way that we calculate the benefits of water-sensitive urban design? No, not yet. We still think about water-sensitive urban design as delivering harvested storm water. And yet, if you look at the health budget, that far exceeds whatever amount of water you want to harvest. And in the end of the day, if we actually do this and deliver beautiful and activated public spaces, we increase the livability of our cities. And what drives the economy of our city? The people. And who wants to live in and what are some of the choices people make in terms of which city they want to go to? Why do they all want to go to Melbourne? Because it's the world's most livable city. I come from Melbourne, so I have to say that. Now, if you think of all of those green infrastructure that I talk about, and then you say, what if we link them? What if we now create blue and green corridors that define our cities? For too long now, our cities are defined by the gray and black corridors, the roads. And yet, every city when built, most of us tend to ignore the natural depressions in our catchments. We tend to cover it up, put a pipe through it and ignore them, and put gridded roads into it. And that's how our cities are defined. And yet, if we actually start to rethink our city and say, what if we connected all the open space with green corridor and make sure that they are passage for flood waters? That's where the water goes to. And we now introduce green infrastructure to cleanse that water. What if we did that? You actually deliver significant flood protection in a densifying city. We also create significant public landscapes for microclimate cooling, increase the urban biodiversity. All of those things we have proof of concept for now. What is missing is actually the proper urban design framework to pull them together. This, and of course I did talk about productive landscape, that those connected green space can be orchards, by the way. Nothing wrong with orchards being in a green space, and they could be community gardens and so on. We can have all of them. It's all through good urban design. And this is sort of the concept that we have whereby I say, how do you build a water-sensitive city? Or how do you convert a city into a water-sensitive city? One precinct at a time. There is constantly redevelopment in our cities. Now, if in the redevelopment of our cities that we are careful to ensure each of those attributes can best be delivered through the urban design, we will actually commence our journey into converting cities into water-sensitive cities. For example, why couldn't we have wetlands that are within our city that cleanse the water that runs off our city while create a fantastic landscape for the public? The green walls that are supplied by grey water that filters through the green wall that is ultimately collected in the bottom of the building, which can then be pumped up to a header tank that gravity feeds into our toilets. That our drainage line doesn't need to be a pipe in the ground, but could in fact be used to enhance the waterways in our cities, such as what we can see in Korea. Downtown Seoul. That the water features keeping water in the landscape improves the microclimate simply through evapotranspiration. That the water art actually creates the value and the sense of place for people that enjoys living in those areas. That stormwater filters are part of the landscape, and that trees are a prominent part that actually provides shade and cooling in our city, La Rambla in Barcelona. That we should connect the open space in terms of orchards as part of our cityscape. That we can start to think about the water energy nexus, whereby in locally gas-fired energy production, the waste heat from that could be used to deliver hot water service without an additional amount of energy required. I mean, do we know that there's so much energy used in creating hot water in our household at the moment? The connection of productive landscape to wastewater recycling, the simplest form of nutrient recovery. Simply applying treated wastewater to irrigate our landscape. It's the simplest form of nutrient recovery. And if we can do that over time, bits and pockets of our city will become water-sensitive precincts, and we will deliver a water-sensitive city. That is the journey. The proof of concept for technology is there. The urban design examples are there, and I'd like to finish with an example of what we're doing in Melbourne. Fisherman's Bend is one of the largest brownfield redevelopment projects in Melbourne. At the moment, it's about 250 hectares. The new government has decided to expand it now to about 400 hectares. When it was 250 hectares, it was to house 100,000 residents, involving $30 billion of private sector investment in this area, just across the river from the CBD. The water utilities intend to spend $500 million of new water infrastructure for this development. Our CRC, together with our partners, most of the water utilities in Melbourne, came together and said, what should we actually do with this precinct to ensure that it is a water-sensitive precinct that captures all of those points that we talk about. Now, to make matters even worse, this whole site is a contaminated site. Okay? And therefore, digging into the ground is difficult. It is also on Cook Island silt, and therefore, subsurface infrastructure was something that we wanted to avoid. Interestingly, we came up with 14 ideas in the work we do, and the 14 ideas capture three range of scales. The whole of Fisherman's Bend scale, the precinct scale, there are 7 precincts in there, and the building scale. And our ideas actually are delivered at those 3 levels. One of the key things is the whole notion about podium design. In that project, because of the fact that you can't have basements, the architects are basically saying that the car parks are actually needed to be up here, and that in fact the living space in many of those need to be built on a podium as such. Now that immediately provides us with the opportunity that simply through gravity we can bring a lot of the stormwater onto surface and not actually need to build them into the ground. And that in the process of water traveling to the surface, it will be filtered through. The notion, and another concept that came out of, and I don't have time to talk about it, is the notion of pressure sewer. How pressure sewer can actually schedule the delivery of sewer to your existing sewage treatment plant that actually optimizes its operation and actually avoid and fill in the gaps of the diurnal pattern of sewer delivery. Right? And how pressure sewers enable us to think about small bore trenchless construction that meant that construction on this site was going to be a lot easier, and that it didn't have to follow a fixed gradient like a gravity sewer, and that it can actually move around, avoid services and whatever. It avoids infiltration, inflow, and leakage, whereby the sizing of the discharge of sewer to our treatment plant is significantly reduced because of the reduction in infiltration, inflow from the surrounding soil. That's just some of the examples of this. The notion of looking at the green spine as the main thoroughfare, not just for traffic, but for flood water. By the way, it was also flood prone, Fisherman's Bend. So just to add to that, the notion that the flood passage ought to be part of the green spine of the system, and how the green spine needs to connect back to the local streets, because that's how you deliver microclimate benefits. One of the things that we've learned about microclimate benefits is that the sphere of influence of a green area is perhaps limited, and that we need to bring the green vegetation as close to the end of the street as you can. So how the main spine then connects to local streets or green corridors throughout. We actually look at water recycling, and in fact came to the conclusion that the traditional way of water recycling and the use of Class A water, recycled water in the household, is a situation whereby it is a demand-limited scenario. What we mean by that is that we actually generate more recycled water than there is demand for it, right? Because of the restricted use. We wanted to create a no regrets infrastructure whereby we know that in future, if we actually went to looking at grey water treatment to potable, which is only a matter of time, in fact the technology is out there already, that if we actually look at grey water treatment to potable and look at how green walls could in fact be the first filter of the grey water before it goes into a more formalized grey water treatment plant, we actually get to a supply limited scenario, because now we are replacing potable water, and that the capacity of the system, the recycling system, is limited by its supply rather than the demand. So we are able to optimize the use of recycled water based on those concepts. These are some of the performance outcomes from the work that was done for Fisherman's Bend as a result of capturing those visions that we talk about. Just fantastic outcomes, supporting 100,000 people and still deliver 70% less sewer flow than what would typically occur in a traditional approach to these things. So my point really is that the solutions for a water-sensitive city is one that requires to think across sectors, because the beneficiaries cut across sectors, and therefore the governance issues, the co-funding, and the co-responsibility for its operation and maintenance need to cut across sectors. But there are three key principles that defines everything that we do. The notion that our cities are water supply catchment, and how the governance need to reflect that. The notion that technologies and design today will enable our cities to provide ecosystem services. And ultimately, the social and institutional capital to build a water-sensitive city. A community that's aware, the profession that has the skills to innovate, and government that delivers enabling policies. Those are the ingredients of what I believe a future city, a future water-sensitive city would have. Thank you.